How about we go on ahead and get with it? Good evening, everybody. It is time for another reading from Fingerprints of the Gods. We're on chapter 43. We're coming up to the end of the book, but not quite there. I think we've got about 10 chapters total, maybe a bit more. So I'm going to do 4 chapters tonight because these are shorter ones. That'll leave 3 more for this part of the book, and then I should be able to do the last reading in one sitting. The last part of the book. I think it's only 3 chapters. So, here we go. Chapter 43, Looking for the First Time. Here is what the ancient Egyptians said about the first time. Zep-Tepi. When the gods ruled in their country, they said it was a golden age, during which the waters of the abyss receded, the primordial darkness was banished, and humanity, emerging into the light, was offered the gifts of civilization. Excuse me. They spoke also of intermediaries between gods and men, the Urshu, a category of lesser divinities whose title meant the Watchers, and they preserved particularly vivid recollections of the gods themselves. I've seen this word before, but I know I'm not pronouncing it right. I'm going to say puissant. I've only ever seen it written. I've never heard it spoken. Puissant. Puissant and beautiful beings called the Neteru, who lived on Earth with humankind and exercised their sovereignty from Heliopolis and other sanctuaries up and down the Nile. Some of these Neteru were male and some female, but all possessed a range of supernatural powers which included the ability to appear at will as men or women, or as animals, birds, reptiles, trees, or plants. Paradoxically, their words and deeds seem to have reflected human passions and preoccupations. Likewise, although they were portrayed as stronger and more intelligent than humans, it was believed that they could grow sick or even die or be killed under certain circumstances. Records of prehistory. Archaeologists are adamant that the epoch of the gods, which the ancient Egyptians called the first time, is nothing more than a myth. The ancient Egyptians, however, who may have been better informed about their past than we are, did not share this view. The historical records they kept in their most venerable temples included comprehensive lists of all the kings of Egypt, lists naming every pharaoh of every dynasty recognized by scholars today. Some of these lists went even further, reaching back beyond the historical horizon of the first dynasty into the uncharted depths of a remote and profound antiquity. 2 lists of kings in this category have survived the ravages of the ages and, having been exported from Egypt, are now preserved in European museums. We shall consider these lists in more detail later in this chapter. They are known respectively as the Palermo stone, dating from the 5th dynasty, around the 25th century BC, and the Turin Cyprus, the Turin Papyrus, a 19th dynasty temple document inscribed in a cursive form of hieroglyphs known as hieratic and dated to the 13th century BC. In addition, we have the testimony of a Heliopolitan priest named Manetho. In the 3rd century BC, he compiled a comprehensive and widely respected history of Egypt, which provided extensive king lists for the entire dynastic period. Like the Turin Papyrus and the Palermo stone, Manetho's history also reached much further back into the past to speak of a distant epoch when gods had ruled in the Nile Valley. Manetho's complete text does not come down to us, although copies of it seem to have been in circulation as late as the 9th century AD. Fortuitously, however, fragments of it were preserved in the writings of the Jewish chronicler Josephus, AD 60, and of Christian writers such as Africanus, AD 30, AD 300, Eusebius, AD 340, and George Syncellus, AD 800. These These fragments, in the words of the late Professor Michael Hoffman of the University of South Carolina, provide the, quote, framework of modern approaches to the study of Egypt's past, end quote. This is quite true. Nevertheless, Egyptologists are prepared to use Manetho only as a source for the historical dynastic period and repudiate the strange insights he provides into prehistory when he speaks of the remote golden age of the first time. Why should we be so selective in our reliance on Manetho? What is the logic of accepting 30 historical dynasties from him and rejecting all that he has to say about earlier epochs? Moreover, since we know that his chronology for the historical period has been vindicated by archaeology, isn't it a bit premature for us to assume that his pre-dynastic chronology is wrong because excavations have not yet turned up evidence confirming it? Excuse me. Gods, demigods, and spirits of the dead. If we are to allow Manetho to speak for himself, we have no choice but to turn to the texts in which the fragments of his work are preserved. One of the most important of these is the Armenian version of the Chronica of Eusebius. It begins by informing us that it is extracted, quote, from the Egyptian history of Manetho, who composed his account in 3 books. These deal with the gods, the demigods, the spirits of the dead, and the mortal king who ruled Egypt, end quote. Citing Manetho directly, Eusebius begins by reeling off a list of the gods which consists essentially of the familiar Ennead of Heliopolis, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Set, and so on. Quote, these were the first to hold sway in Egypt. Thereafter the kingship passed from one to another in unbroken succession through 13,900 years. After the demigods reigned for 1,255 years, and again another line of kings held sway for 1,817 years. Then came 30 more kings reigning for 1,790 years, and then again 10 kings ruling for 350 years. There followed the rule of the spirits of the dead for 5,813 years. End quote. The total of all these periods adds up to 24,925 years and takes us far beyond the biblical date for the creation of the world, sometime in the 5th millennium BC. Because it suggested that biblical chronology was wrong, this created difficulties for Eusebius, a staunchly Christian commentator. But after a moment's thought, he overcame the problem in an inspired way. Quote, the year I take to be a lunar one, consisting, that is, of 30 days, what we now call a month, the Egyptians used formerly to style a year, end quote. Of course, they did no such thing. By means of this sleight of hand, however, Eusebius and others succeeded in boiling down Manetho's grand pre-dynastic span of almost 25,000 years into a sanitized dollop a bit over 2,000 years, which fits comfortably into the 2,242 years Orthodox biblical chronology allows between Adam and the flood. A different technique for downplaying the disturbing chronological implications of Manetho's evidence is employed by the monk George Syncellus, A.D. 800. This commentator, who relies entirely on invective, writes, quote, Manetho, chief priest of the accursed temples of Egypt, tells us of gods who never existed. These, he says, reigned for 11,895 years. End quote. Several other curious and contradictory numbers crop up in the fragments. In particular, Manetho is repeatedly said to have given the enormous figure of 36,525 years for the entire duration of the civilization of Egypt, excuse me, from the time of the gods down to the end of the 30th and last dynasty of mortal kings. This figure, of course, incorporates the 365.25 days of the Sothic year, the interval between 2 consecutive heliacal risings of Sirius, as described in the last chapter. More likely by design than by accident, it also represents 25 cycles of 1460 Celtic years and 25 cycles of 1461 calendar years. Since the ancient Egyptian civil calendar was constructed around a vague year of 365 days exactly. What if anything, does all this mean? It's hard to be sure. Out of the welter of numbers and interpretations, however, there is one aspect of Manetho's original message that comes through loud and clear. Irrespective of anything we have been taught about the orderly progress of history, what he seems to be telling us is that civilized beings, either gods or men, were present in Egypt for an immensely long period before the advent of the first dynasty around 3100 BC. Diodorus, Siculus, and Herodotus. In this assertion, Manetho finds much support among classical writers. In the 1st century BC, for example, the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus visited Egypt. He is rightly described by C.H. Oldfather, his most recent translator, as, quote, an uncritical compiler who used good sources and reproduced them faithfully, end quote. In plain English, what this means is that Diodorus did not try to impose his prejudices and preconceptions on the material he collected. He is therefore particularly valuable to us because his informants included Egyptian priests whom he questioned about the mysterious past of their country. This is what they told him. Quote, at first gods and heroes ruled Egypt for a little less than 18,000 years, the last of the gods to rule being Horus, the son of Isis. Mortals have been kings of their country, they say, for a little less than 5,000 years. End quote. Let us review these figures uncritically and see what they add up to. Diodorus was writing in the 1st century BC. If we journey back from there for the 5,000 years during which the mortal kings supposedly ruled, we get to around 5100 BC. If we go even further back to the beginning of the age of gods and heroes, we find that we have arrived at 23,100 BC, when the world was still firmly in the grip of the last ice age. Long before Diodorus, Egypt was visited by another and more illustrious Greek historian, the great Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BC. He too, it seems, consorted with priests, and he too managed to tune in to traditions that spoke of the presence of a high civilization in the Nile Valley at some unspecified date in remote antiquity. Herodotus outlines these traditions of an immense prehistoric period of Egyptian civilization in Book 2 of his History. In the same document, he also hands on to us, without comment, a peculiar nugget of information which had originated with the priests of Heliopolis. Quote, during this time, they said, there were 4 occasions when the sun rose out of his wonted place, twice rising where he now sets, and twice setting where he now rises. End quote. What is this all about? According to the French mathematician Schwaller de Lubitz, what Herodotus is transmitting to us, perhaps unwittingly, is a veiled and garbled reference to a period of time, that is, to the time that it takes for sunrise on the vernal equinox to precess against the stellar background through 1.5 complete cycles of the zodiac. As we have seen, the equinoctial sun spends roughly 2160 years in each of the 12 zodiacal constellations. A full cycle of precession of the equinoxes, therefore, takes almost 26,000 years to complete, 12 times 2160 years. It follows that 1.5 cycles takes nearly 39,000 years, 18 times 2160 years. In the time of Herodotus, the sun on the vernal equinox rose due east at dawn against the stellar background of Aries, at which moment the constellation of Libra was, quote unquote, in opposition, lying due west where the sun would set 12 hours later. If we wind the clock of precession back half a cycle, however, 6 houses of the zodiac are approximately 13,000 years. We find that the reverse configuration prevails. The vernal sun now rises due east in Libra, while Aries lies due west in opposition. A further 13,000 years back, the situation reverses itself once more, with the vernal sun rising again in Aries and with Libra in opposition. This takes us to 26,000 years before Herodotus. If we then step back another 13,000 years, another half precessional cycle, to 39,000 years before Herodotus, the vernal sunrise returns to Libra and Aries is again in opposition. The point is this: the 39,000 years we have with 30. Let me start that over again. The point is this: with 39,000 years, we have an expansive time during which the sun can be described as twice rising where he now sets, i.e., in Libra in the time of Herodotus, and again at 13,000 and at 39,000 years earlier, and as quote unquote twice setting where he now rises, i.e., in Aries in the time of Herodotus, and again at 13,000 and 39,000 years earlier. If Schwaller's interpretation is correct, and there is every reason to suppose it is, it suggests that the Greek historians' priestly informants must have had access to accurate records of the precessional motion of the sun going back at least 39,000 years before their own era. The Turin Papyrus and the Palermo Stone. The figure of 39,000 years accords surprisingly closely with the testimony of the Turin Papyrus, one of the two surviving ancient Egyptian king lists that extends back into prehistoric times before the First Dynasty. Originally in the collection of the king of Sardinia, the brittle and crumbling 3,000-year-old papyrus was sent in a box without packing to its present home in the Museum of Turin. As any school child could have predicted, it arrived broken into countless fragments. Scholars were obliged to work for years to piece together and make sense of what remained, and they did a superb job. Nevertheless, more than half the contents of this precious record proved impossible to reconstruct. What might we have learned about the first time if the Turin Papyrus had remained intact? The surviving fragments are tantalizing. In one register, for example, we read the names of 10 Neteru, with each name inscribed in a cartouche oblong enclosure, in much the same style adopted in later periods for the historical kings of Egypt. The number of years that each Neter was believed to have reigned was also given, but most of these numbers are missing from the damaged document. In another column, there appears a list of the mortal kings who ruled in Upper and Lower Egypt after the gods, but prior to the supposed unification of the kingdom under Menes, the first pharaoh of the First Dynasty in 3100 BC. From the surviving fragments, it is possible to establish that 9 dynasties of these pre-dynastic pharaohs were mentioned, among which were the quote unquote the venerable of Memphis, the venerables of the north, and lastly the Shemsu-Hor, the companions or followers of Horus, who ruled until the time of Menes. The the final 2 lines of the column, which seem to represent a summing up or inventory, are particularly provocative. They read, quote, Venerables Shemsu-Hor, 13,420 years. Reigns before the Shemsu-Hor, 23,200 years. Total, 36,620 years, end quote. The other king list that deals with prehistoric times is the Palermo stone, which does not take us as far back into the past as the Turin papyrus. The earliest of its surviving registers record the reigns of 120 kings who ruled in Upper and Lower Egypt in the late pre-dynastic period, the centuries immediately prior to the country's unification in 3100 BC. Once again, however, we really have no idea how much other information, perhaps relating to far earlier periods, might originally have been inscribed in this enigmatic slab of black basalt, because it too has not come down to us intact. Since 1887, the largest single part has been preserved in the Museum of Palermo in Sicily. A second piece is on display in Egypt in the Cairo Museum, and a third, much smaller fragment is in the Petrie collection at the University of London. These are reckoned by archaeologists to have been broken out of the center of a monolith which would originally have measured about 7 feet long by 2 feet high, stood on its long side. Furthermore, as one authority has observed, quote, "It is quite possible, even probable, that many more pieces of this invaluable monument remain, if we only knew where to look. As it is, we are faced with the tantalizing knowledge that a record of the name of every king of the archaic period existed, together with the number of years of his reign and the chief events which occurred during his occupation of the throne, and these events were compiled in the fifth dynasty, only about 700 years after the unification, so that the margin of error would in all probability have been very small." End quote. The late Professor Walter Emery, whose words these are, was naturally concerned about the absence of much needed details concerning the archaic period, 3200 BC to 2900 BC, the focus of his own specialist interests. We should also spare a thought, however, for what an intact Palermo stone might have told us about even earlier epochs, notably Zep Tepi, the golden age of the gods. The deeper we penetrate into the myths and memories of Egypt's long past, and the closer we approach to the fabled first time, the stranger the landscapes that surround us become, as we shall see. That is the end of that first chapter for the night, chapter 43. So let's jump right on into 44. Gods of the First Time. According to Heliopolitan theology, the 9 original gods who appeared in Egypt in the first time were Ra, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and Set. The offspring of these deities included well-known figures such as Horus and Anubis. In addition, other companies of gods were recognized, notably at Memphis and Hermopolis, where there were important and very ancient cults dedicated to Ptah and to Thoth. These first-time deities were all, in one sense or another, gods of creation who had given shape to chaos through their divine will. Out of that chaos they formed and populated the sacred land of Egypt, wherein, for many thousands of years, they ruled among men as divine pharaohs. What was chaos? The Heliopolitan priests who spoke to the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus in the first century BC, put forward the thought-provoking suggestion that chaos was a flood identified by Diodorus with the earth-destroying flood of Deucalion, the Greek Noah figure. Quote, "In general, they say that if in the flood which occurred in the time of Deucalion most living things were destroyed, it is probable that the inhabitants of southern Egypt survived rather than any others. Or if as some maintain, the destruction of living things was complete, and the earth then brought forth again new forms of animals. Nevertheless, even on such a supposition, the first genesis of living things fittingly attaches to this country. End quote. Why should Egypt have been so blessed? Diodorus was told that it had something to do with its geographical situation, with the great exposure of its southern regions to the heat of the sun, and with the vastly increased rainfall which the myths said the world had experienced in the aftermath of the universal deluge. Quote, "For when the moisture from the abundant rains which fell among other peoples was mingled with the intense heat which prevails in Egypt itself, the air became very well tempered for the first generation of all living things." End quote. Curiously enough, Egypt does enjoy a special geographical situation, as is well known. The latitude and longitude lines which intersect just beside the Great Pyramid, 30 degrees north and 31 degrees east, cross more dry land than any others. Curiously, too, at the end of the last ice age, when millions of square miles of glaciation were melting in northern Europe, when rising sea levels were flooding coastal areas all around the globe, and when the huge volume of extra moisture released into the atmosphere through the evaporation of the ice fields was being dumped as rain, Egypt benefited for several thousands of years from an exceptionally humid and fertile climate. It is not difficult to see how such a climate might indeed have been remembered as, quote, "well tempered for the first generation of all living things." End quote. The question, therefore, has to be asked: whose information about the past are we receiving from Diodorus, and is the apparently accurate description of Egypt's lush climate at the end of the last ice age a coincidence, or is an extremely ancient tradition being transmitted to us here, a memory perhaps of the first time? Breath of the divine serpent. Ra was believed to have been the first king of the first time, and ancient myths say that as long as he remained young and vigorous, he reigned peacefully. The passing years took their toll on him, however, and he is depicted at the end of his rule as an old, wrinkled, stumbling man with a trembling mouth from which saliva ceaselessly dribbles. Shu followed Ra as king on earth, but his reign was troubled by plots and conflicts. Although he vanquished his enemies, he was in the end so ravaged by disease that even his most faithful followers revolted against him. Quote, "Weary of reigning, Shu abdicated in favor of his son Geb and took refuge in the skies after a terrifying tempest which lasted 9 days." End quote. Geb, the third divine pharaoh, duly succeeded Shu to the throne. His reign was also troubled, and some of the myths describing what took place reflect the odd idiom of the pyramid texts in which a non-technical vocabulary seems to wrestle with complex technical and scientific imagery. For example, one particularly striking tradition speaks of a golden box in which Ra had deposited a number of objects, described respectively as his rod or cane, a lock of his hair, and his uraeus, a rearing cobra with its hood extended, fashioned out of gold, which was worn on the royal headdress. A powerful and dangerous talisman, this box, together with its bizarre contents, remained enclosed in a fortress on the eastern frontier, quote unquote, of Egypt until a great many years after Ra's ascent to heaven. When Geb came to power, he ordered that it should be brought to him and unsealed in his presence. In the instant that the box was opened, a bolt of fire, described as the, quote, "breath of the divine serpent," end quote, ushered from it, struck dead all Geb's companions, and gravely burned the god king himself. It is tempting to wonder whether what we are confronted by here might not be a garbled account of a malfunctioning man-made device, a confused, awe-stricken recollection of a monstrous instrument devised by the scientists of a lost civilization. Weight is added to such extreme speculations when we remember that this is by no means the only golden box in the ancient world that functioned like a deadly and unpredictable machine. It has a number of quite unmissable similarities to the Hebrews' enigmatic Ark of the Covenant, which also struck innocent people dead with bolts of fiery energy, which also was overlaid round about with gold, quote unquote, and which was said to have contained not only the two tablets of the Ten Commandments, but the quote, the golden pot that had manna and Aaron's rod, end quote. A proper look at the implications of all these weird and wonderful boxes and of other technological artifacts referred to in ancient traditions is beyond the scope of this book. For our purposes, here it is sufficient to note that a peculiar atmosphere of dangerous and quasi-technological wizardry seems to surround many of the gods of the Heliopolitan Ennead. Isis, for example, wife and sister of Osiris and mother of Horus, carries a strong whiff of the science lab. According to the Chester Beatty papyrus in the British Museum, she was, quote, a clever woman, more intelligent than countless gods. She was ignorant of nothing in heaven and earth, end quote. Renowned for her skillful use of witchcraft and magic, Isis was particularly remembered by the ancient Egyptians as, quote unquote, strong of tongue. That is, being in command of words of power, quote, which she knew with correct pronunciation and halted not in her speech, and was perfect both in giving the command and in saying the word, end quote. In short, she was believed by means of her voice alone to be capable of bending reality and overriding the laws of physics. These same powers, though perhaps in greater degree, were attributed to the wisdom god Thoth, who also, not a member of the Heliopolitan Ennead, is recognized. I'm sorry, who, although not a member of the Heliopolitan Ennead, is recognized in the Turin Papyrus and other ancient records as the sixth, or sometimes as the seventh, divine pharaoh of Egypt, frequently represented on temple and tomb walls as an ibis, or an ibis-headed man. Thoth was venerated as the regulative force responsible for all heavenly calculations and annotations, as the lord and multiplier of time, the inventor of the alphabet, and the patron of magic. He was particularly associated with astronomy, mathematics, surveying, and geometry, and was described as, quote, he who reckons in heaven the counter of the stars and the measurer of the earth, end quote. He was also regarded as a deity who understood the mysteries of, quote, all that is hidden under the heavenly vault, end quote, and who had the ability to bestow wisdom on selected individuals. It was said that he had inscribed his knowledge in secret books and hidden these about the earth, intending that they should be sought for by future generations, but found, quote, only by the worthy, end quote, who were to use their discoveries for the benefit of mankind. What stands out most clearly about Thoth, therefore, in addition to his credentials as an ancient scientist, is his role as the benefactor and civilizer. In this respect, he closely resembles his predecessor, Osiris, the high god of the pyramid text and the fourth divine pharaoh of Egypt, quote, whose name becometh Sa, Orion, whose leg is long and his stride extended, the president of the land of the south, end quote. Osiris and the Lords of Eternity. Occasionally referred to in the text as Nebtem, or Universal Master, Osiris is depicted as human but also superhuman, suffering but at the same time commanding. Moreover, he expresses his essential dualism by ruling in heaven as the constellation of Orion and on earth as a king among men. Like Viracocha in the Andes and Quetzalcoatl in Central America, his ways are subtle and mysterious. Like them, he is exceptionally tall and always depicted wearing the curved beard of divinity. And like them too, although he has supernatural powers at his disposal, he avoids the use of force wherever possible. We saw in chapter 16 that Quetzalcoatl, the god king of the Mexicans, was believed to have departed from Central America by sea, sailing away on a raft of serpents. It is therefore hard to avoid a sense of deja vu when we read in the Egyptian Book of the Dead that the abode of Osiris also, quote unquote, rested on water and had walls made of, quote, living serpents, end quote. At the very least, the convergence of symbolism linking these two gods and two far-flung regions is striking. There are other obvious parallels as well. The central details of the story of Osiris have been recounted in earlier chapters, and we need not go over them again. The reader will not have forgotten that this god, once again, like Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, was remembered principally as a benefactor of mankind, as a bringer of enlightenment, and as a great civilizing leader. He was credited, for example, with having abolished cannibalism and was said to have introduced the Egyptians to agriculture, in particular to the cultivation of wheat and barley, and to have taught them the art of fashioning agricultural implements. Since he had an especial liking for fine wines, the myths do not say where he acquired this taste, he made a point of, quote, teaching mankind the culture of the vine as well as the way to harvest the grape and to store the wine, end quote. In addition to the gifts of good living he brought to his subjects, Osiris helped to wean them, quote, from their miserable and barbarous manners, end quote, by providing them with the code of laws and inaugurating the cult of the gods in Egypt. When he had set everything in order, he handed over the control of the kingdom to Isis, quit Egypt for many years, and roamed about the world with the sole intention, Diodorus Siculus was told, quote, of visiting all the inhabited earth and teaching the race of men how to cultivate the vine and sow wheat and barley, for he supposed that if he made men give up their savagery and adopt a gentle manner of life, he would receive immortal honors because of the magnitude of his benefactions. End quote. Osiris traveled first to Ethiopia, where he taught tillage and husbandry to the primitive hunter-gatherers he encountered. He also undertook a number of large-scale engineering and hydraulic works. Quote, he built canals with floodgates and regulators. He raised the river banks and took precautions to prevent the Nile from overflowing. End quote. Later he made his way to Arabia and thence to India, where he established many cities. Moving on to Thrace, he killed a barbarian king for refusing to adopt his system of government. This was out of character. In general, Osiris was remembered as by the Egyptians for having, quote, forced no man to carry out his instructions, but by means of gentle persuasion and an appeal to their reason, he succeeded in inducing them to practice what he preached. Many of his wise counsels were imparted to his listeners in hymns and songs which were sung to the accompaniment of instruments of music. End quote. Once again, the parallels with Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha are hard to avoid. During a time of darkness and chaos, quite possibly linked to a flood, a bearded god or man materializes in Egypt or Bolivia or Mexico. He is equipped with a wealth of practical and scientific skills of the kind associated with mature and highly developed civilizations, which he uses unselfishly for the benefit of humanity. He is instinctively gentle but capable of great firmness when necessary. He is motivated by a strong sense of purpose, and after establishing his headquarters at Heliopolis or Tiwanaku or Teotihuacan, he sets forth with a select band of companions to impose order and to reinstate the lost balance of the world. Leaving aside for the present the issue of whether we are dealing here with gods or men, with figments of the primitive imagination or with flesh and blood beings, the fact remains that the myths always speak of a company of civilizers. Viracocha has his companions, as have both Quetzalcoatl and Osiris. Sometimes there are fierce internal conflicts within these groups and perhaps struggles for power, and battles between Seth and Horus, and between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl are obvious examples. Moreover, whether the mythical events unfold in Central America or in the Andes or in Egypt, the upshot is also always pretty much the same. The civilizer is eventually plotted against and either driven out or killed. The myths say that Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha never came back, although we have seen their return to the Americas was expected at the time of the Spanish conquest. Osiris, on the other hand, did come back, although he was murdered by Set soon after the completion of his worldwide mission to make men, quote, give up their savagery, end quote. He won eternal life through his resurrection in the constellation of Orion as the all-powerful god of the dead, thereafter judging souls and providing an immortal example of responsible and benevolent kingship. He dominated the religion and the culture of ancient Egypt for the entire span of its known history. Serene stability. Who can guess what the civilizations of the Andes and of Mexico might have achieved if they too had benefited from such powerful symbolic continuity? In this respect, however, Egypt is unique. Indeed, although the pyramid texts and other archaic sources recognize a period of disruption and attempted usurpation by Set and his 72 processional conspirators, they also depict the transition to the reigns of Horus, Thoth, and the later divine pharaohs as being relatively smooth and inevitable. This transition was mimicked through thousands of years by the mortal kings of Egypt. From the beginning to the end, they saw themselves as the lineal descendants and living representatives of Horus, son of Osiris. As generation succeeded generation, it was supposed that each deceased pharaoh was born in the sky as an Osiris, and that each successor to the throne became a Horus. This simple, refined, and stable scheme was already fully evolved and in place at the beginning of the first dynasty, around 3100 BC. Scholars accept this. The majority also accept that what we are dealing with here is a highly developed and sophisticated religion. Strangely, very few Egyptologists or archaeologists have questioned where and when this religion took shape. Is it not to defy logic to suppose that well-rounded social and metaphysical ideas like those of the Osiris cult sprung up, fully formed in 3100 BC, or that they could have taken such perfect shape in the 300 years which Egyptologists sometimes grudgingly allow for them to have done so? There must have been a far longer period of development than that, spread over several thousands rather than several hundreds of years. Moreover, as we have seen, every surviving record in which the ancient Egyptians speak directly about their past asserts that their civilization was a legacy of the gods who were the first to hold sway in Egypt, quote unquote. The records are not internally consistent. Some attribute much greater antiquity to the civilization of Egypt than others. All, however, clearly and firmly direct our attention to an epoch far, far in the past, anything from 8,000 to almost 40,000 years before the foundation of the first dynasty. Archaeologists insist that no material artifacts have ever been found in Egypt to suggest that an evolved civilization existed at such early dates, but this is not strictly true. As we saw in Part 6, a handful of objects and structures exist which have not yet been conclusively dated by any scientific means. The ancient city of Abydos conceals one of the most extraordinary of these undatable enigmas. And that is the end of that chapter. The next chapter is much longer, but it has pictures. So it'll go relatively quickly. I'm still going to do 4 tonight, but um, where are we at on time? Yeah, it's been 40. It's going to be at least that before I finish tonight. It'll be another probably 45 minutes before I finish. I am going to go take a quick break and refill my water before I start into this chapter. So I will be right back. Hold on, hang out. Be back in a minute. Okay, back at it. Looks like we might have an ad starting in just a minute, but that's okay. So, chapter 45, The Works of Men and Gods. Among the numberless ruined temples of ancient Egypt, there is one that is unique not only for its marvelous state of preservation, which, rare indeed, includes an intact roof, but for the fine quality of the many acres of beautiful reliefs that decorate its towering walls. Located at Abydos, 8 miles west of the present course of the Nile, this is the temple of Seti the First, a monarch of the illustrious 19th dynasty who ruled from 1306 to 1290 BC. Seti is known primarily as the father of a famous son, Ramses II, 1290 to 22 to 1224, the pharaoh of the biblical Exodus. In his own right, however, he was a major historical figure who conducted extensive military campaigns outside of Egypt's borders, who was responsible for the construction of several fine buildings, and who carefully and conscientiously refurbished and restored many older ones. His temple at Abydos, which was known evocatively as, quote, the house of millions of years, end quote, was dedicated to Osiris, the Lord of Eternity, quote unquote, of whom it was said in the pyramid texts, quote, you have gone, but you will return. You have slept, but you will awake. You have died, but you will live. Betake yourself to the waterway, fare upstream, travel about Abydos in this spirit form of yours, which the gods commanded to belong to you, end quote. Atef crown. It was 8 in the morning, a bright, fresh hour in these latitudes, when I entered the hushed gloom of the temple of Seti the First. Sections of its walls were floor lit by low wattage electric bulbs. Otherwise, the only illumination was that which the pharaoh's architects had originally planned, a few isolated shafts of sunlight that penetrated through slits in the outer masonry like beams of divine radiance. Hovering among the motes of dust dancing in those beams, and infiltrating the heavy stillness of the air amid the great columns that held up the roof of the hypostyle hall, it is easy to imagine that the spirit form of Osiris could still be present. Indeed, this was more than just imagination, because Osiris was physically present in the astonishing symphony of reliefs that adorned the walls. Reliefs that depicted the once and future civilizer king in his role as god of the dead, enthroned and attended by Isis, his beautiful and mysterious sister. In these scenes, Osiris wore a variety of different and elaborate crowns, which I studied closely as I walked from relief to relief. Crowns similar to these in many respects had been important parts of the wardrobe of all the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, at least on the evidence of reliefs depicting them. Strangely, however, in all the years of intensive excavations, archaeologists had not found a single example of a royal crown, or a small part of one, let alone a specimen of the convoluted ceremonial headdresses associated with the gods of the first time. In particular, of particular interest was the Atef crown, incorporating the uraeus, the royal serpent symbol, which in Mexico was a rattlesnake, but in Egypt was a hooded cobra poised to strike. The central core of this strange contraption was recognizable as an example of the hedjet, the white skittle-shaped war helmet of Upper Egypt, again known only from reliefs. Rearing up on either side of this core were what seemed to be two thin leaves of metal, and at the front was an attached device consisting of two wavy blades, which scholars normally describe as a pair of ram's horns. In several reliefs of the Seti I temples, Osiris was depicted wearing the Atef crown, which seemed to stand about 2 feet high, according to the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. It had been given to him by Ra, quote, "But on the very first day that he wore it, Osiris had much suffering in his head, and when Ra returned in the evening he found Osiris with his head angry and swollen from the heat of the Atef crown. Then Ra proceeded to let out the pus and the blood." End quote. All this was stated in a matter-of-fact way, but when you stop to think about it, what kind of crown was it that radiated heat and caused the skin to hemorrhage and break out in pustulent sores? Okay, we have a picture of Abydos. So let me bring that up. So the Osirian, Seti the First Temple, Temple of Ramses II. Okay, back at it here. 17 centuries of kings. I walked on into the deeper darkness, eventually finding my way to the Gallery of the Kings. It led off from the eastern edge of the inner hypostyle hall about 200 feet from the entrance to the temple. To pass through the gallery was to pass through time itself. On the wall to my left was a list of 120 of the gods of ancient Egypt, together with the names of their principal sanctuaries. On my right, covering an area of perhaps 10 feet by 6 feet, were the names of the 76 pharaohs who had preceded Seti I to the throne. Each name was carved in hieroglyphs inside an oval cartouche. This tableau was known as the Abydos King List. Glowing with colors of molten gold, it was designed to be read from left to right and was divided into 5 vertical and 3 horizontal registers. It covered a grand expanse of almost 1,700 years, beginning around 3000 BC with the reign of Menes, first king of the first dynasty, and ending with Seti's own reign around 1300 BC. At the extreme left stood 2 figures exquisitely carved in high relief, Seti and his young son, the future Ramses II. hypogeum, I'm going to guess is what this word is, belonging to the same class of historical documents as the Turin Papyrus and the Palermo stone. The list spoke eloquently of the continuity of tradition, and an inherent part of that tradition was the belief or memory of a first time long, long ago when the gods had ruled in Egypt. Principal among those gods was Osiris, and it was therefore appropriate that the Gallery of the Kings should provide access to a second corridor leading to the rear of the temple where a marvelous building was located, one associated with Osiris from the beginning of written records in Egypt, and described by the Greek geographer Strabo, who visited Abydos in the 1st century BC, as, quote, a remarkable structure built of solid stone, containing a spring which lies at a great depth, so that one descends to its down vaulted galleries made of monoliths of surpassing size and workmanship. There is a canal leading to the place from the great river. End quote. A few hundred years after Strabo's visit, when the religion of ancient Egypt had been supplanted by the new cult of Christianity, the silt of the river and the sands of the desert began to drift into the Osirian, filling it foot by foot, century by century, until its upright monoliths and huge lintels were buried and forgotten, and so it remained out of sight and out of mind until the beginning of the 20th century, when the archaeologists Flinders Petrie and Margaret Murray began excavations. In their 1903 season of digging, they uncovered parts of a hall and passageway lying in the desert about 200 feet southwest of the Seti, the first temple, and built in the recognizable architectural style of the 19th dynasty. However, sandwiched between these remains and the rear of the temple, they also found unmistakable signs that, quote, a large underground building, end quote, lay concealed. This hypogeum, wrote Margaret Murray, quote, appears to Professor Petrie to be the place that Strabo mentions, usually called Strabo's Well, end quote. This was good guesswork on the part of Petrie and Murray. Shortage of cash, however, meant that their theory of a buried building was not tested until the digging season of 1912-13. Then, under the direction of Professor Neville of the Egypt Exploration Fund, a long transverse chamber was cleared, at the end of which, to the northeast, was found a massive stone gateway made of cyclopean blocks of granite and sandstone. The next season, 1913-14, Neville and his team returned with 600 local helpers and diligently cleared the whole of the huge underground building. Quote, what we discovered, Neville wrote, is a gigantic construction of about 100 feet in length and 60 in width, built with the most enormous stones that may be seen in Egypt. In the four sides of the enclosure walls are cells, 17 in number, of the height of a man and without ornamentation of any kind. The building itself is divided into 3 naves, the middle one being wider than those of the sides. The division is produced by 2 colonnades made of huge granite monoliths supporting architraves of equal size. End quote. Neville commented with some astonishment on one block he measured in the corner of the building's northern nave, a block more than 25 feet long. Equally surprising was the fact that the cells cut into the enclosure walls had no floors, but turned out, as the excavations went deeper, to be filled with increasingly moist sand and earth. Quote, the cells are connected by a narrow ledge between 2 and 3 feet wide. There is a ledge also on the opposite side of the nave, but no floor at all, and in digging to a depth of 12 feet we reached infiltrated water. Even below the great gateway there is no floor, and when there was water in front of it, The cells were probably reached with a small boat. End quote. The most ancient stone building in Egypt. Water, water everywhere. This seems to be the theme of the Osirian, which lay at the bottom of the huge crater Neville and his men had excavated in 1914. It was positioned some 50 feet below the level of the floor of the Seti I temple, almost flush with the water table, and was approached by a modern stairway curving down to the southeast. Having descended this stairway, I passed under the hulking lintel slabs of the great gateway Neville and Strabo had described, and crossed a narrow wooden footbridge, again modern, which brought me to a large sandstone plinth. Measuring about 80 feet in length by 40 feet in width, this plinth was composed of enormous paving blocks and was entirely surrounded by water. Two pools, one rectangular and the other square, had been cut into the plinth along the center of its long axis, and at either end stairways led down to a depth of about 12 feet below the water level. The plinth also supported the two massive colonnades Neville mentioned in his report, each of which consisted of 5 chunky rose-colored granite monoliths about 8 feet square by 12 feet high and weighing on average around 100 tons. The tops of these huge columns were spanned by granite lintels, and there was evidence that the whole building had once been roofed over with a series of even larger monolithic slabs. Okay, and then we have another picture. Plan of the Osirian. So let me show you that. That's all it says, and it has no labels on it, so there you go. It's for what it's worth. I think these are the two. If this is representative of water, then this is the two staircases going down 12 feet below the water level that he mentioned here and here. Okay. To get a proper understanding of the structure of the Osirian, I found it helpful to raise myself directly above it in my mind's eye so that I could look down on it. This exercise was assisted by the absence of the original roof, which made it easier to envisage the whole edifice in plan. Also helpful was the fact that water had now seeped up to fill all of the building's pools, cells, and channels to a depth of a few inches below the lip of the central plinth, as the original designers had apparently intended it should. Looking down in this manner, it was immediately apparent that the plinth formed a rectangular island surrounded on all 4 sides by a water-filled moat about 10 feet wide. The moat was contained by an immense rectangular enclosure wall, no less than 20 feet thick, made of very large blocks of red sandstone disposed in polygonal jigsaw puzzle patterns. Into the huge thickness of this wall were set the 17 cells mentioned in Neville's report. 6 lay to the east, 6 to the west, 2 to the south, and 3 to the north. Off the central of the 3 northern cells lay a long transverse chamber roofed with and composed of limestone. A similar transverse chamber, also of limestone, but no longer with an intact roof, lay immediately south of the great gateway. Finally, the whole structure was enclosed within an outer wall of limestone, thus completing a sequence of internested rectangles, i.e., from the outside in, wall, moat, plinth. Another notable and outstandingly unusual feature of the Osirian was that it was not even approximately aligned to the cardinal points. Instead, like the Way of the Dead at the Teotihuacan Teotihuacan in Mexico, it was oriented to the east of due north. Since ancient Egypt had been a civilization that could and normally did achieve precise alignments for its buildings, it seems to me improbable that this apparently skewed orientation was accidental. Moreover, although 50 feet higher, the Seti, the first temple, was oriented along exactly the same axis, and again not by accident. The question was, which was the older building? Had the axis of the Osirian been predetermined by the axis of the temple, or vice versa? This, it turned out, was an issue over which considerable controversy, now long forgotten, had once raged. In a debate which had many connections with that surrounding the Sphinx and the Valley Temple at Giza, eminent archaeologists had initially argued that the Osirian was a building of truly immense antiquity, a view expressed by Professor Neville in the London Times of 17 March 1914. And we have another picture, reconstruction of the Osirian. And then I'll go ahead and read the quote. I'll show you the picture first. Oh, whoops! I hit the wrong thing. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the reconstruction of the Osirian. So what it was supposed to look like with a full roof and all that, I guess. Okay. Anyway, so the quote was, "This monument raises several important questions as to its date. Its great similarity with the Temple of the Sphinx at the Valley Temple was then known, as the Valley Temple was then known, shows it to be of the same epoch when building was made with enormous stones without any ornament. This is characteristic of the oldest architecture in Egypt. I should only say that we may call it the most ancient stone building in Egypt." End quote. Describing himself as overawed by the quote unquote grandeur and stern simplicity of the monument's central hall with its remarkable granite monoliths, and by quote the power of those ancients who could bring from a distance and move such gigantic blocks, end quote, Neville made a suggestion concerning the function of the Osirian. Oh, concerning the function the Osirian might originally have been intended to serve. Quote, "Evidently, this huge construction was a large reservoir where water was stored during the high Nile. It is curious that what we may consider as a beginning in architecture is neither a temple nor a tomb, but a gigantic pool, a waterwork." End quote. Curious indeed, and well worth investigating further, something Neville hoped to do the following season. Unfortunately, the First World War intervened, and no archaeology could be undertaken in Egypt for several years. As a result, it was not until 1925 that the Egypt Exploration Fund was able to send out another mission, which was led not by Neville, but by a young Egyptologist named Henry Frankfurt. Frankfurt's facts. Later to enjoy great prestige and influence as professor of pre-classical antiquity at the University of London, Frankfurt spent several consecutive digging seasons re-clearing the thoroughly re-clearing and thoroughly excavating the Osirian between 1925 and 1930. During the course of his work, he made discoveries which, so far as he was concerned, quote, "settled the date of the building," end quote. And we have a numbered list. 1. A granite dovetail in position at the top of the southern side of the main entrance to the central hall, which was inscribed with the cartouche of Seti I. 2. A similar dovetail in position inside the eastern wall of the central hall. 3. Astronomical scenes and inscriptions by Seti I, carved in relief on the ceiling of the northern transverse chamber. 4. The remains of similar scenes in the southern transverse chamber. And 5. An ostracon, piece of broken potsherd, found in the entrance passage and bearing the legend, Seti is serviceable to Osiris. The reader will recall the lemming behavior which led to a dramatic change of scholarly opinion about the antiquity of the Sphinx and of the Valley Temple due to the discovery of a few statues and a single cartouche which seemed to imply some sort of connection with Khafre. Frankfurt's finds at Abydos caused a similar volte-face, volte, I'm not sure. It's VOLTE dash FACE. Volte-face? I don't know. Over the antiquity of the Osirian. In 1914 was, quote, the most ancient stone building in Egypt, end quote. By 1933, it had been beamed forward in time to the reign of Seti I around 1300 BC, whose cenotaph it was now believed to be. Within a decade, the standard Egyptological texts began to print the attribution to Seti I as though it were a fact, verifiable by experience or observation. It is not a fact, however, merely Frankfurt's interpretation of the evidence he had found. The only facts are the certain inscriptions and decorations left by Seti appear in an otherwise completely anonymous structure. One plausible explanation is that the structure must have been built by Seti as Frankfurt proposed. The other possibility is that the half-hearted and scanty decorations, cartouches, and inscriptions found by Frankfurt could have been placed in the Osirian as part of a renovation and repair operation undertaken in Seti's name, implying that the structure was by then ancient, as Neville and others had proposed. One of the merits of these mutually contradictory propositions, which identify the Osirian as A, the oldest building in Egypt, and B, a relatively late New Kingdom structure. Proposition B, that is the that it is the cenotaph of Seti I, is the only attribution accepted by Egyptologists. On close inspection, however, it rests on the circumstantial evidence of the cartouches and inscriptions which prove nothing. Indeed, part of this evidence appears to contradict Frankfurt's case. The ostracon bearing the legend Seti is serviceable to Osiris sounds less like praise for the works of an original builder than praise for a restorer who had renovated and perhaps added to an ancient structure identified with the first time god Osiris. And another awkward little matter has also been overlooked. The south and north transverse chambers, which contain Seti I's detailed decorations and inscriptions, lie outside the 20-foot thick enclosure wall, which so adamantly defines the huge, undecorated megalithic core of the building. This had raised a reasonable suspicion in Neville's mind, though Frankfurt chose to ignore it, that the two chambers concerned were, quote, not contemporaneous with the rest of the building, end quote, but had been added much later during the reign of Seti I, quote, probably when he built his own temple, end quote. To cut a long story short, therefore, everything about Proposition B is based in one way or another on Frankfurt's not necessarily infallible interpretation of various bits and pieces of possibly intrusive evidence. Proposition A, that the core edifice of the Osirian had been built millennia before Seti's time, rests on the nature of the architecture itself. As Neville observed, the Osirian's similarity to the Valley Temple at Giza, quote, showed it to be of the same epoch when building was made with enormous stones, end quote. Likewise, until the end of her life, Margaret Murray remained convinced that the Osirian was not a cenotaph at all, least of all Seti's. She said, quote, it was made for the celebration of the mysteries of Osiris, and so far is unique among all the surviving buildings of Egypt. It is clearly early, for the great blocks of which it is built are of the style of the Old Kingdom. The simplicity of the actual building also points to it being of that early date. The decoration was added by Seti I, who in that way laid claim to the building, but seeing how often a pharaoh claimed the work of his predecessors by putting his name on it, this fact does not carry much weight. It is the style of the building, the type of the masonry, the tooling of the stone, and not the name of a king, which dated a building in Egypt. End quote. This was an admonition Frankfurt might well have paid more attention to, for as he bemusedly observed of his cenotaph, quote, it was to be admitted that no similar building is known from the 19th dynasty, end quote. Indeed, it is not just a matter of the 19th dynasty. Apart from the Valley Temple and other Cyclopean edifices on the Giza Plateau, no other building remotely resembling the Osirian is known from any other epoch of Egypt's long history. This handful of supposedly Old Kingdom structures built out of giant megaliths seems to belong in a unique category. They resemble one another much more than they resemble any other known style of architecture, and in all cases there are question marks over their identity. Isn't this precisely what one would expect of buildings not erected by any historical pharaoh, but dating back to prehistoric times? Because it makes sense of the mysterious way in which the Sphinx and the Valley Temple, and now the Osirian as well, seem to have become vaguely connected with the names of particular pharaohs, Khafre and Seti I, without ever yielding a single piece of evidence that clearly and unequivocally proves these pharaohs built the structures concerned. Aren't the tenuous links much more indicative of the work of restorers seeking to attach themselves to ancient and venerable monuments than the original architects of these monuments, whoever they might have been and in whatever epoch they might have lived? We're getting close to the end of this chapter. Setting sail across seas of sand and time. Before leaving Abydos, there was one other puzzle that I wanted to remind myself of. It lay buried in the desert about a kilometer northeast of the Osirian, across sands littered with rolling, cluttered tumuli of ancient graveyards. But out among these cemeteries, many of which dated back to early dynastic and pre-dynastic times, the jackal gods Anubis and Upuat had traditionally reigned supreme. Openers of the way, guardians of the spirits of the dead, I knew that they had played a central role in the mysteries of Osiris that had been enacted each year at Abydos, apparently throughout the span of ancient Egyptian history. It seemed to me that there was a sense in which they guarded the mysteries still. For what was the Osirian if was not a huge, I think there's a typo there, or a word missing. Um, for what was the Osirian if was not a huge unsolved mystery? That's, I'm not sure what's supposed to be there. I'll just read it as is, I guess. For what was the Osirian if was not a huge unsolved mystery that deserved closer scrutiny than it was received from the scholars whose job it is to look into these matters. And what was the burial in the desert of 12 proud, seagoing ships, if not also a mystery that cried out loudly for solution? It was the burial place of those ships I was now crossing, the cemeteries of the jackal gods to see. Quote, The Guardian, London, 21 December 1991. A fleet of 5,000-year-old royal ships has been found buried 8 miles from the Nile. American and Egyptian archaeologists discovered the 12 large wooden ships at Abydos. Experts said the boats, which are 50 to 60 feet long, are about 5,000 years old, making them Egypt's earliest royal ships and among the earliest ships found anywhere. The experts say the ships discovered in September were probably meant for burial, so the souls of the pharaohs could be transported on them. We never expected to find such a fleet, especially so far from the Nile, said David O'Connor, the expedition leader and curator of the Egyptian section of the University Museum of the University of Pennsylvania. End quote. The boats were buried in the shadow of a gigantic mud brick enclosure thought to have been the mortuary temple of a second dynasty pharaoh named Khasek Hemwi, who had ruled Egypt in the 27th century BC. O'Connor, however, was certain that they were not associated directly with Khasek Hemwi, but rather with the nearby and largely ruined, quote, funerary cult enclosure built for Pharaoh Jer early in Dynasty 1. The boat graves are not likely to be earlier than this, and may in fact have been built for Jer, but this remains to be proven. End quote. A sudden strong gust of wind blew across the desert, scattering sheets of sand. I took refuge for a while in the lee of the looming walls of the Kashikemwe enclosure, close to the point where the University of Pennsylvania archaeologists had, for legitimate security reasons, buried the 12 mysterious boats they had stumbled on, reburied the 12 mysterious boats they had stumbled on in 1991. They had hoped to return in 92 to continue the excavations, but there had been various hitches, and in 1993 the dig was still being postponed. In the course of my research, O'Connor had sent me the official report of the 1991 season. Mentioned in passing that some of the boats might have been as much as 72 feet in length. He also noted that the boat-shaped brick graves in which they were enclosed, which would have risen well above the level of the surrounding desert in early dynastic times, must have produced quite an extraordinary effect when they were new. Quote, Each grave had originally been thickly coated with mud plaster and whitewash, so the impression would have been of 12 or more huge boats moored out in the desert, gleaming brilliantly in the Egyptian sun. The notion of their being moored was taken so seriously that an irregularly shaped small boulder was found placed near the prow or stern of several boat graves. These boulders could not have been there naturally or by accident. Their placement seemed deliberate, not random. We can think of them as anchors intended to help moor the ships. End quote. Like the 140-foot ocean-going vessel found buried beside the Great Pyramid at Giza, see Chapter 33, one thing was immediately clear about the Abydos boats. They were of an advanced design capable of riding out the most powerful waves and the worst weather of the open seas. According to Cheryl Haldane, a nautical archaeologist at Texas A&M University, they show, quote, a high degree of technology combined with grace, end quote. Exactly as was the case with the pyramid boat, therefore, but at least 500 years earlier, the Abydos fleet seemed to indicate that a people able to draw upon the accumulated experiences of a long tradition of seafaring had been present in Egypt from the very beginning of its 3,000-year history. Moreover, I knew that the earliest wall paintings found in the Nile Valley, dating back perhaps as much as 1,500 years before the burial of the Abydos fleet to around 4,500 BC, showed the same long, sleek, high-prowed vessels in action. Could an experienced race of ancient seafarers have become involved with the indigenous inhabitants of the Nile Valley at some indeterminate period before the official beginning of history at around 3000 BC? Wouldn't this explain Egypt's curious and paradoxical but nonetheless enduring obsession with ships in the desert and references to what sounded like sophisticated ships in the pyramid texts, including one said to have been more than 2,000 feet long? In raising these conjectures, I did not doubt that religious symbolism had existed in ancient Egypt, in which, as scholars endlessly pointed out, ships had been designated as vessels for the pharaoh's soul. Nevertheless, that symbolism did not solve the problem posed by the high level of technological achievement of the buried ships. Such evolved and sophisticated designs called for a long period of development. Wasn't it worth looking into the possibility, even if only to rule it out, that the Giza and Abydos vessels could have been parts of a cultural legacy not of a land-loving, riverside-dwelling, agricultural people like the indigenous ancient Egyptians, but of an advanced seafaring nation? Such seafarers could have been expected to be investigators who would have known how to set a course by the stars and who would perhaps also have developed the skills necessary to draw up accurate maps and charts of the oceans they had traversed. Might they also have been architects and stonemasons whose characteristic medium had been polygonal megalithic blocks like those of the Valley Temple and the Osirian? And might they have been associated in some way with the legendary gods of the first time, said to have brought to Egypt not only civilization and astronomy and architecture and the knowledge of mathematics and writing, but a host of other useful skills and gifts, by far the most notable and the most significant of which had been the gift of agriculture? There is evidence of an astonishingly early period of agricultural advance and experimentation in the Nile Valley at about the end of the last ice age in the northern hemisphere. The characteristics of this Egyptian leap forward suggest that it could only have resulted from an influx of new ideas from some as yet unidentified source. Whew, we made it to the end of that chapter. Now, the next one is short, quite short, actually. So I am going to go ahead and do chapter 46 tonight. That'll leave three chapters for next reading to finish out part 7 of the book. And then we'll just have part 8 left, which may or may not be done in one session. I'll have to look at how long it is. All right. Chapter 46, the 11th millennium BC. If it were not for the powerful mythology of Osiris, and if this civilizing, scientific, law-making deity was not remembered in particular for having introduced domesticated crops into the Nile Valley in the remote and fabled epoch known as the First Time, it would probably not be a matter of any great interest that at some point between 13,000 BC and 10,000 BC, Egypt enjoyed a period of what has been described as precocious agricultural development, end quote, quote unquote. Possibly the earliest agricultural revolution anywhere in the world identified with certainty by historians. As we saw in recent chapters, sources such as the Palermo Stone, Manetho, and the Turin Papyrus contain several different and at times contradictory chronologies. All these chronologies nevertheless agree on a very ancient date for the first time of Osiris, the golden age when the gods were believed to have ruled in Egypt. In addition, the sources demonstrate a striking convergence over the importance they accord to the 11th millennium BC in particular, the processional age of Leo, when the great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere were undergoing their final ferocious meltdown. Perhaps coincidentally, evidence unearthed since the 1970s by geologists, archaeologists, and prehistorians like Michael Hoffman, Fakhri Hassan, and Professor Fred Wendorf has confirmed that the 11th millennium BC was indeed an important period in Egyptian prehistory, during which immense and devastating floods swept repeatedly down the Nile Valley. Fakhri Hassan has speculated that this prolonged series of natural disasters, which reached a crescendo around or just after 10,500 BC and continued to recur periodically until around 9,000 BC, might have been responsible for snuffing out the early agricultural experiment. At any rate, that experiment did come to an end for whatever reason, and appears not to have been attempted again for at least another 5,000 years. Kickstart. There is something mysterious about Egypt's so-called quote, Paleolithic agricultural revolution, end quote. Here quoted from the standard texts, Hoffman's Egypt Before the Pharaohs and Wendorf and Schild's Prehistory of the Nile Valley are some key facts from the little that is known about this great leap forward that occurred so inexplicably towards the end of the last ice age. And again, we have a numbered list. 1. Shortly after 13,000 BC, grinding stones and sickle blades with a glossy sheen on their bits, the result of silica from cut stems adhering to a sickle's cutting edge, appear in late Paleolithic toolkits. It is clear that the grinding stones were used in preparing plant food. 2. At many riverside sites at exactly this time, fish stopped being a significant food source and became a negligible one, as evidenced by the absence of fish remains. The decline in, and there's a quote within this number, quote, the decline in fishing as a source of food is related to the appearance of a new food source represented by ground grain. The associated pollen strongly suggests that this grain was barley, and significantly, this large grass pollen, tentatively identified as barley, makes a sudden appearance in the pollen profile just before the time when the first settlements were established in this area. End quote. 3. And this one's a quote too. Quote, as apparently spectacular as the rise of proto-agriculture in the late Paleolithic Nile Valley was its precipitous decline. No one knows exactly why, but after about 10,500 BC, the early sickle blades and grinding disappeared to be replaced throughout Egypt by Epipaleolithic hunting, fishing, and gathering peoples who used stone tools. End quote. And that's the end of the numbered list. Ooh, excuse me. Scanty though the evidence may be, it is clear in its general implications. Egypt enjoyed a golden age of agricultural plenty, which began around 13,000 BC and was brought to an abrupt halt around the middle of the 11th millennium BC. A kickstart to the process appears to have been given by the introduction of already domesticated barley into the Nile Valley, immediately followed by the establishment of a number of farming settlements which exploited the new resource. The settlements were equipped with simple but extremely effective agricultural tools and accessories. After the 11th millennium BC, however, there was a prolonged relapse to more primitive ways of life. The imagination is inclined to roam freely over such data in search of an explanation, and all such explanations can only be guesswork. What is certain is that none of the evidence suggests that Paleolithic Egypt's agricultural revolution could have been a local initiative. On the contrary, it feels in every way like a transplant. A transplant appears suddenly, after all, and can be rejected equally fast if conditions change, just as settled agriculture seems to have been rejected in ancient Egypt after the Great Nile floods of the 11th millennium BC. What was the weather like then? Oh, climate change. What was the weather like then? We've noted in earlier chapters that the Sahara, a relatively young desert, was green savanna until about the 10th millennium BC. This savanna, brightened by lakes boiling with game, extended across much of Upper Egypt. Further north, the delta area was marshy but dotted with many large and fertile islands. Overall, the climate was significantly cooler, cloudier, and rainier than it is today. Indeed, for 2 or 3 thousand years before and about 1,000 years after 10,500 BC, it rained and rained and rained. Then, as though marking an ecological turning point, the floods came. When they were over, increasingly arid conditions set in. This period of desiccation lasted until approximately 7,000 BC, when the Neolithic subpluvial began, with 1,000 years of heavy rains followed by 3,000 years of moderate rainfall, which once again proved ideal for agriculture. Quote, for a time the deserts bloomed and human societies colonized areas that had been unable to support such dense populations since. End quote. By the birth of dynastic Egypt around 3000 BC, however, the climate had turned around again and a new period of desiccation had begun, one that has continued until the present day. This, then, in broad outline, is the environmental stage upon which the mysteries of Egyptian civilization have been played out. Rain and floods between 13,000 and 9,500 BC, a dry period until 7,000 BC, rain again, though increasingly less frequent, until about 3,000 BC, thereafter a renewed and enduring dry period. The expanse of years is great, but if one is looking for a first time within which might with, within it which might accord with the golden age of the gods, one's thoughts turn naturally to the mysterious epoch of early agricultural experimentation that shadowed the great rains and floods between 13,000 BC and 10,500 BC. We're almost there. Unseen connections. This epoch was crucial not only for the ancient Egyptians, but for many peoples in other areas. Indeed, as we saw in part 4, it was the epoch of dramatic climate shifts, rapidly rising sea levels, earth movements, floods, volcanic eruptions, bituminous rains, and darkened skies that was the most probable source of many of the great worldwide myths of universal cataclysm. Could it also have been an epoch in which gods really did walk among men, as the legends say? On the Bolivian Altiplano, those gods were known as the Viracochas and were linked to the astonishing megalithic city of Tiwanaku, which may have pre-existed the immense floods in the Andes in the 11th millennium BC. Thereafter, according to Professor Arthur Poznansky, though the floodwaters subsided, quote, the culture of the Altiplano did not again retain a high point of development, but rather fell into a total and definitive decadence, end quote. Of course, Poznansky's conclusions are controversial and must be evaluated on their own merits. Nevertheless, it is interesting that both the Bolivian Altiplano and Egypt should have been scoured by immense floods in the 11th millennium BC. In both areas, too, there are signs that extraordinarily early agricultural experiments, apparently based on introduced techniques, were attempted and then abandoned. And in both areas, important question marks have been raised over the dating of monuments. The Pumapunka, the Kalasasaya in Tiahuanaco, for example, which Poznansky argued might have been built as early as 15,000 BC. And in Egypt, megalithic structures like the Osirian, the Great Sphinx, and the Valley Temple of Khafre at Giza, which John West and the Boston University geologist Robert Schoch have dated on geological grounds to earlier than 10,000 BC. Could there be an unseen connection linking all these beautiful enigmatic monuments, the anomalous agricultural experiments of 13,000 to 10,000 BC, and the legends of civilizer gods like Osiris and Viracocha? Where is the rest of this civilization? As we set out on the road from Abydos to Luxor, there we were, where we were to meet John West, I realized that there was a sense in which all the connections would look after themselves if the central issue of the antiquity of the monuments could be settled. In other words, if West's geological evidence proved that the Sphinx was more than 12,000 years old, the history of human civilization was going to have to be rewritten. As part of that exciting process, all the other strange anachronistic fingerprints of the gods that kept appearing around the world and the sense of an undercurrent of ancient connections linking apparently unrelated civilizations would begin to make sense. When West's evidence was presented in 1992 at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, it had been taken seriously enough to be publicly debated by the Chicago University Egyptologist Mark Lehner, director of the Giza Mapping Project, who, to the astonishment of almost everybody present, had been unable to come up with a convincing refutation. Quote, when you say something as complex as the Sphinx dates to 9,000 or 10,000 BC, Lehrer had concluded, it implies, of course, that there was a very high civilization that was capable of producing the Sphinx at that period. The question an archaeologist has to ask, therefore, is this. If the Sphinx was made at that time, then where is the rest of this civilization? Where is the rest of this culture? End quote. Leonard, however, was missing the point. If the Sphinx did date to 9,000 or 10,000 BC, the onus was not on West to produce other evidence for the existence of the civilization which produced it, but on Egyptologists and archaeologists to explain how they had got things so wrong, so consistently for so long. So, could West prove the antiquity of the Sphinx? And that is the end of that chapter. We are on to chapter 47, 48, 49 for next time. These are longer chapters by a fair bit. That one chapter was fairly long that we read tonight. All three of the chapters remaining are that long or nearly that long. So it's going to be another long reading, but that'll conclude part 7 of the book, though, leading us to the last 3 chapters, which are all fairly long. So it'll be 2 more long readings and we'll be done with this book. So that's all I have for tonight. I am done. My voice is wrecked. So I will leave it off there, and I will see you all in the reading tomorrow night for Star Wars. Have a good night.